Morning, everyone. Today, I am speaking finally to an economist to break a little bit away from the geopolitics and from the engineering stuff. And it's a fascinating book that we're going to talk today. It's Charlie Robertson's book, The Time Traveling Economist. So, Charlie, welcome.
Thank you very much, Hugo, for having me on. It's a privilege. Thank you.
So, in the book that I've got here in front of me, and I've already tweeted and told people, please buy this book to understand poverty, to understand development, things of that sort. You sketch a economist's view of energy, electricity, and fertility. Now, the first question I've got, if I look at these three variables, is asking you, what has this got to do with economists?
That took me a very long time to think was important. So I've been doing this job and as an emerging market economist frontier for nearly 30 years. I didn't write a specific report just on education until 2017, just 5 years ago. It took me 4 years ago to do a specific report on electricity. And then 3 years ago, demographics, fertility. So for a long, long time, it didn't seem to matter to me, those issues. And then I realized that it was actually explaining everything that I needed to be saying about countries when I talk to investors. So my job is to talk to fund managers, private equity groups, sometimes corporates who are investing in various countries in the world to help tell them where should they invest and when. This book tries to answer all of that.
So you narrowed down all these factors to three variables. Now, a critique would say, isn't that maybe a bit of a simplistic picture, of how the world works?
I guess I've been at too many conferences, particularly in Africa over the last decade, where everything's getting raised as an issue. And I look at the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, and there's some 25, 30 of them, and there's so many goals. Imagine a football pitch with 30 goals around it. I mean, you're trying to get one, but how can you protect all? How can you get them all at the same time? You can't do that. And I guess what I'm trying to say is actually it boils down to these three. And I show that in data going back to the 17th, 18th century for every country in the world. I explain how their development happened based on these three variables, and it does help. It helps give people a very clear worldview, because I'm saying these are the only three numbers you need to know when you go to a country are its adult literacy rate, its electricity consumption per person, and its fertility rate. And you will be 95% right then in your assumptions about everything else, from per capita GDP to the age of the population to everything. So I genuinely think it really works.
Yeah. Well, the data you cited is well substantiated. At least the correlations are there. I mean, I cannot obviously, economists generally avoid causality because, you work in econometrics. I want to sort of start with the first variable that you sketched out there, education. Now, this should not be a controversial statement, but why is education and literacy in particular so important for development?
Well, I mean, we've got to start off with the point that it's not widely understood that it is. You go to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and I read through it to make sure that he doesn't mention adult literacy once. In his seminal book, he's the grandfather of economics. He doesn't mention literacy. And the reason he doesn't do it, I think, is because in Scotland, in the late 18th century, everybody was literate, pushed by religion at the time. And as recently as 10 years ago, Danny Roderick, fantastic development economist, he's saying to work in a textile mill, to get out of subsistence farming and to go and work in a textile mill, all you need is dexterous fingers. Yeah. And unconscious, perhaps, echo exactly of what Adam Smith said 250 years ago. He said, that's what you need, just dexterity in the fingers. It's not true. I've spoken to people who run textile mills. They don't employ illiterate people. Yeah. Because when the guy I spoke to and did Levi's jeans back in Sri Lanka and the Philippines in the 20th century, he said, when the jeans are rolling down the production line, do the staff put it into the box for Europe or America? And he's using that very simplistic example, but it's valid across the board. Illiterate people struggle even with something as basic as textiles. And we forget that. Those of us, who are lucky enough to have been literate since we can remember, we forget that. Anyways, so I look back at the theories. And the theories show us that if you haven't got 40% adult literacy, you don't grow sustainably. That's Mali, Somalia, Afghanistan until just a very, very few years ago. And until you get to 70, 80% adult literacy, you cannot industrialize. And that.
So I want to start there with countries with low literacy rates, because it's not just the fact that people can't get jobs. You also show quite good data that these countries are prone to coup d'états. They are prone to political instability, to violence, to war, internal civil war, things of that sort, right?
Absolutely right. So the difficulty with being a low literacy society is that because you can't grow sustainably, usually your population is growing fast. It gets linked to demography and fertility. We'll get to that later. You've got a growing population, not enough jobs, and a sense of dissatisfaction then with whoever is in power. And that dissatisfaction leads to actually support for military coups. You've seen crowds cheering in Burkina Faso and Mali when the military have taken over in the last year or two, because people are so unhappy with the state of the economy, the fact that their economies are not growing, and yet the population's growing, so people are just getting no better off. And it's anyway. So yes, we see that instability.
And the interesting one to me that I saw in your book is you said when Iran had its revolution in 1979, contrary to those who praised the Shah, literacy was only 36%.
Yeah, he had oil wealth, but he was spending it on British tanks and military equipment to kind of keep himself in power. It wasn't he wasn't spreading the gains to the people, and I think part of perhaps why the current regime has lasted as long as it has in Iran is because they did bring literacy to the population, and that made a big difference to that country's fortunes.
Yeah, so there's somebody here who wants to challenge you already on that. And the literacy, I just don't understand the argument against it. But a guy said, I disagree. Literacy also leads to bureaucracy, and it makes it easier for others in power to steal and use it from others. So basically, he's saying there's going to be more corruption if people can read and write.
There is a really strong link. I talk about corruption in chapter 6. The strongest link between corruption and any other indicator that I look at is per capita GDP. So the poorest countries in the world have the worst corruption scores in Transparency International's surveys. And that hasn't changed in the 30 years, since the mid-90s they've been doing these surveys. That hasn't changed. So what guarantees low per capita GDP? What guarantees it is low literacy, because you never get rich. You can't escape your low per capita GDP figure. So absolute corruption stays in place in illiterate countries. In literate countries, eventually, when they get rich enough, and it's really quite wealthy, it's like $25,000-$30,000 per capita GDP, bang, the corruption numbers completely jump. Countries get much better scores. I'm not saying there isn't lobbying and all the rest. In rich countries there is, but in Korea today we've got 4 presidents in jail for corruption. So finally the Koreans are saying enough is enough. But it's taken them until they get to $25,000-$30,000 per capita GDP before they've done that.
Okay, and that was one of the controversies as well in your book. But I sort of just want to stay last point on literacy, and we sort of transition to the next one, which is electricity. But you make the point that the first step of industrialization is usually textiles, but there are also some exceptions to that, like mining, right?
Mining can be supportive, but in the main, most countries don't have populations that are too big for mining to be a huge driver of prosperity. We've had a recent example of how this is often misunderstood in Peru. The current president of Peru comes from the mining province in Peru, where all of its wealth is being mined, primarily copper and some gold. And he thinks that Peru should be wealthy on the back of its minerals. And in the province itself, if all of the revenues were just in that province, he's right. A bit like in Congo. If all of the copper revenues could just be kept in Katanga province, then Katanga would be very well off. Like Botswana is. Yeah. So mining can do it, but it really helps to have a tiny population and a vast amount of mineral wealth. Most countries are not that lucky.
So that also speaks to the misperception of wealth. I mean, it's a common mistake that African leaders have made in the past, particularly, and I'm sure in the rest of the world as well, where they think that the amount of resources in the ground equates to the amount of wealth of a country. And we still have politicians, South Africa's parliament, saying we are the richest country in the world just on the basis of all our resources. I mean, that's not entirely true.
It's I think it's really dangerous to be resting on that mistaken view, actually. And I've been tweeting for a best part of a decade now, numbers out of Nigeria, showing that every day per 1,000 people, they've been exporting about 10 barrels of oil. It's now less than that. It's more like 5 per 1,000 people. And but the headline that everyone knows about in Nigeria is that they are pumping out 2 million barrels, which isn't that different from some Gulf countries. But those Gulf countries have vastly smaller populations. And as a result, they're pumping out 200 to 400 barrels of oil every day per 1,000 people, while Nigeria is doing 5. So they have money. Nigeria is never going to get wealthy on the back of oil. And I don't think Congo is ever going to get wealthy actually on the back of copper, even with the renewables excitement for copper. The numbers are just not there. There's too many people, 100 million in Congo pretty well. Yeah. It's got to be human capital. It's got to be the people who make the country rich.
And human capital is also the one that Adam Smith definitely spoke to in his work. He was one of the first to realize it's the skills and the trades, and I suppose that is where the next variable comes in, which is electricity. Now, maybe can you explain for the audience what is the exact stage? I mean, you spoke about 60-70% literacy, and then we can go over to starting expanding electricity. I've heard people in the energy sector saying that's nonsense, and they say we should start expanding electricity immediately, and you push back against this idea.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of this came from actually giving speeches in East Africa, and the Kenyans were pointing out to me that we've got enough electricity. In fact, we've got a surplus of electricity right now, and we've got this literate population, and you're saying we can industrialize with that, and I'm saying that's right. The data's clear. East Africa's got enough educated people to be able to lift into that textiles revolution, but the power consumption is not there. So this took quite a long time for me to understand what was going on, and what was going on, I think, is that the power supply needs to be cheap, reliable, and plentiful. And to get cheap, powerful, and plentiful energy supply costs a lot of money. Again, unless you're very lucky. If you're sitting on top of an oil well, and that's all you are, Kuwait or UAE, or you were, then you're in a fortunate position, as the English were in the 18th century. They were sat right on top of a whole load of coal fields, and that coal provided the energy that England needed to start the Industrial Revolution. Scotland didn't really have that, which is why more literate Scots ended up going to England and helping support England's Industrial Revolution.
So you agree with the statement that I think Thomas Sowell made, which was it shouldn't be called the British Empire, but the Scottish-led Empire.
There's a lot to be said for that. The Scots were much more literate than the English for a long time. And I'm not just saying that because I've got a Scottish surname. I've got quite a lot of English and indeed Irish in me as well. And there are 3 very different stories. The fertility story is the Irish story. So I guess the question today for policymakers is, should you be focusing on supporting industry and jobs, or should you be trying to push rural electrification? And this is where it gets controversial, because I'm saying, given the expense of energy, you cannot afford to provide cheap, plentiful, reliable energy to your rural communities before there are jobs that can help create the export revenues that can help pay back the debt you've probably taken on to build that energy sector. You've got to have an energy sector that's making money, not losing money. And
I think that's the big mistake that South Africa made, because South Africa expanded rural electrification. It's one of the few successes under the ANC government, and literacy for that matter. But they did not supply enough supply for industry. And of course, they inherited the system, so it gets complicated, with in the mix of the two. But a critique against that would say, but that sounds a little bit callous. You don't want people in their homes to have electricity. So how do you sort of respond to that?
Yeah, if you're unfortunate enough to have come from the poorest county in the UK, as I did, and experienced power cuts in the 1970s on a very regular basis, and spoken to friends of mine in Romania who literally had to study, under candlelight because the power cuts in Ceausescu's Romania. I've got a vast amount of sympathy for the view that everyone should, in the end, get that power supply. What I'm saying is it's unaffordable. And if you take that choice, you will end up defaulting. Now, if you want to default on the debt taken on to build out power, and that money's been supplied by a foreign country, you then have to say, are you prepared to sell your electricity sector to that foreign company, or give it away after you default on the debt? And in fact, will that foreign government or company want to own your electricity sector if they have to make a loss on the sector? They won't even want it. Anyway, the point is it's unaffordable. And it's not a matter of whether you want to or not. Of course, everyone should have, all of these things that we value in life, but it's about when can you afford to do it? And the jobs have to come first. Industry needs to be prioritized.
Well, that's one reason why I always respect the economist's view. It's one of the few professions that argues in terms of trade-offs. That sure, it sounds altruistic to give everyone electricity, but unfortunately, we need to focus it on factories. Now, this is slightly news to somebody in civil engineering, would say, but look, it's not just electricity, it's also transportation, it's also water and sewage collection, as the main systems that brings down life expectancy. Electricity, fine, it's probably one of the most important ones of the other three, but you've argued in the book that electricity should be the first focus before you focus on the other factors, with maybe the exception of transportation. I think you mentioned Tunisia should focus on that.
Yeah. Well, there's two things when you're trying to argue that is this correlated, is this causality. One of the ways to try and get an answer is to look at supporting evidence from wherever it comes from, and the supporting evidence on the energy front versus transportation front or other infrastructure comes from talking to companies themselves. And the World Bank does that every few years. They go out and they survey a load of companies and they say, what is the biggest constraint on your business? And uniformly, in countries with low energy consumption data, the electricity figures that I cite in the book, companies are saying that is the problem. That's the bigger problem, not transportation. We just need power. And we need power. When countries take off, the historic way to do it is you put your factory on a port, next to a port, on the coast, and you export stuff to people richer than you. It's what Japan did in the 1920s. It's what China's done in the 20th century. And then when your coastal region's taken off, because those factories are exporting so competitively, you then spend your export revenues, your savings, to build out infrastructure and transport inland. You've got to start off with that power near the ports. Where does some of UK's industrial revolution happen? It happened near Liverpool, a big port, near Newcastle, and other significant ports. And America, a lot of the wealthiest parts of the States are on the coasts still to this day, because they had access, and it didn't cost you too much to do the transportation then. Rail.
So I was looking at figures about transportation in Africa, and it is a high percentage of GDP. Sub-Saharan Africa is higher than the OECD average, for example. Okay, obviously that's maybe not a fair comparison, but the challenge though in Africa is we don't have navigable rivers. That's always been an obstacle to development. Many African countries are landlocked. So, they would argue, fine, if you have the Seine or the Thames or one of these rivers, great stuff. You put your focus of electricity on the harbor.
Yeah.
What do we do? What do you do if your industrial base and your mining's in Johannesburg, for example?
Yeah. And I say, of course, in the book, if you're Zambia, if you're Ethiopia, you're Congo, you've got no choice. There has to be some decent rail and transportation network that will get you to a coast for you to be able to sell your product. I don't disagree with that. I guess it again comes back to the trade-offs. So one of the debates I talk about in this book is, does it make sense for Nigeria to build a railway line from northern Nigeria into its neighbor to Niger, one of the biggest cities actually in Niger, just to the north, at a cost of $2 billion. And I'm arguing I'd be stunned if that is profitable investment. And if you've got $2 billion to invest, surely there are places like electricity supply in Lagos that you're aware of. There's a good literate population. They need energy, that they could then take off and start making profits on that borrowing, that investment. And those profits then could be reinvested elsewhere in the country later on. It's about making sure that people are focusing on the trade-offs.
So the other elephant in the room here is debt expansion. There's always, when it comes to debt, people are very cynical. And you make the argument, I mean, if it's spent on electricity in particular, when you don't have supply, that it might even be necessary to have debt expansion for a country.
Yeah. And this then, I don't know if you want to feed into this demographic stuff just yet, but because this is where it gets very controversial. But
that's why I'm sort of going into that now.
Okay, so what I was very struck by was a number of things all happening at the same time. First was this big debt expansion, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, or in fact, it's been somewhat global because of globally lower rates, but really quite fast in sub-Sahara, and also other of the frontier economies I've been looking at in writing this book, places like Pakistan. And what struck me about it, what was common to them, was that in so many places, local interest rates were extremely high, and foreign borrowing costs seemed, at face value, to be extremely low. And for a long time, I just sat there and said, okay, well, that's just the way the world is. But the fertility story helped explain that that's not just the way the world is. That's not the way Morocco is. It's not the way Mauritius is. They've not needed to go out and borrow in a big way from abroad to support their industrialization, which is happening. But somehow Kenya has to, and Nigeria has had to, and we've seen this. Ghana has had to, Zambia has had to, and the question was why? Why are interest rates so high in those countries and so low in Mauritius or Morocco or China or Vietnam? And the answer comes from an IMF paper actually that I uncovered a few years back that was showing that household savings in China, which are massive, over half of the increase in the last 30, 40 years has been directly attributed to their fall in the fertility rate. So as you've got smaller and smaller families, people save more and more money. If you've got 6 kids on average, Friday night, you've probably got no cash on average. And if you've got 2 kids, well, you've got to make sure those kids are successful. You've got to make sure they go to school, get a good education, because then they're most likely to earn money. And so you invest in them, you save, and you have some money to save because you're only trying to feed two or three kids. And deposits in the banking system start to pick up. And that's happened globally, everywhere. And there's a really strong link between countries with a fertility rate of 5 to 6 kids, places like Nigeria, Angola, Congo, 5 to 6 kids, and deposits in the banking system of just 20% of GDP, which is tiny. Now, if there's no money in the banking system, 20% of GDP is pretty well no money, then the cost of money, the value of money is really high. So interest rates are double digit in the main. So what do you do when you're trying to invest in energy or infrastructure, transport, electricity? You borrow from abroad, and that triggers or leads eventually to a debt crisis.
That was an interesting observation to me, because I've mentioned to you before that fertility arguments have been well known to city planners and demographers for years. I think they didn't really understand it to the extent that you've now mentioned it, but it's been well known that cities that grow tend to have small families, maybe 2 to 3 children. Cities that are slums tend to have major ones. And it's always been a question of city planners is how do we sort of organize our city in a way to attract these type of families, And I don't. So it's fertility tells a lot of story. I don't think it's just the debt story. It's a lot of factors that come together, maybe that brings down fertility.
So to start with, who goes to the city? And there was this wonderful study I cite from the 1970s in Nigeria, and they looked at various villages in the rural areas, and nearly everyone who got to secondary school like 11 to 18, left. They left those villages after getting their education and they went to the cities. And everyone who stayed illiterate, who didn't even learn to read and write, everyone stayed in the village. Now, the advantage of being literate, of course, is that you get opportunities of jobs that you just don't get when you're illiterate, including the women. So the women are going into the cities as well, and they have a chance to work now because they're literate. So if you're illiterate woman back in a village, and you see this in Niger today, you might have your first kid at 14, after marrying at 13, and your second kid at 17, your third kid by 19. Well, if you stay at school till you're 18, you have your first kid at maybe 19, maybe. So you've already cut the fertility rate by 2 just by educating girls. So who moves to the city? We know from that Nigerian study in the 70s, but we see it globally. It's the literate people who move to the cities. They're more likely to have a significantly lower fertility rate. And then the city has a much higher share of working age adults versus children than the rural area. In the rural area, that illiterate woman back in the village has had 6 or 7 kids. In the city, the woman in the city has 2 to 3 kids. So the number of people who are staying at home to look after the kids gets reduced. The share of the population that's working age adult gets much bigger. So then what happens to that local economy? The urban area, relatively, is the boom story, and the rural area cannot be.
And the governments then sometimes make the mistake to take the surplus from the say the city area and try and invest it in the countryside. And there's talk rural electrification, all those things, and that never really brings the promises of jobs.
Not without those people being educated. They've got to be educated first. That's the first chapter of the book, because unless you get that right, nothing else gets right. There is no rich, illiterate country in the world. Never has been. So you've got to get education right first. And there's if you're rolling out, electricity to some illiterate household, they're not going to have the money to pay for the electricity, because they're not going to have the earnings, because they can't do anything much above subsistence agriculture or very basic manual work. In terms of people won't give them the jobs and won't pay them. It's not a cruel thing to say, it's just a fact. Yeah. So anyway, sorry.
Yeah, and the other interesting stat that you cited was the development of Russia under Stalin. Obviously, Stalin being a dictator, it's not every day that we shouldn't praise Stalin, but we should also acknowledge that communism had some, there were some advances that was being made in terms of literacy and electricity.
Yeah, so what I'm getting at in the book is I'm looking at the issues like education or fertility and saying, so why? Why is fertility here at this number versus that number, or why education? And how quickly can you improve it? Because that matters. If you're sitting in Mali or Guinea today, Somalia, South Sudan, Chad, you've got adult literacy below 40%. How quickly is it possible to get it up? And Stalin shows, the data we have suggests it went from something like 30% at the end of World War I, 1920, to something like 90% in 1940. Now, do we entirely trust what the guys doing the literacy data were telling their boss Stalin? Because if they
didn't he shoot the illiterate, maybe?
We can't entirely trust the data, but we do know that it's not just Stalin who did it. Korea did similar numbers. There's some doubt again about the numbers, but they went for something like 30% in 1945 to about 90%, they say, by 1960. So you can, within 15 to 20 years, Stalin or Korea show the same thing, get your literacy rate up from you cannot grow sustainably, which is most of the Sahel region, northern Nigeria, to you could industrialize in just 20 years, if the government pushes that, prioritizes that, and says this is going to happen.
So you make an argument that government is quintessential to these policies. I mean, the idea that you can run it on a free market basis, it doesn't really clock up if you look at the historical data.
What the data is showing is that the countries that have sped it up the most, it's been very much a government top-down policy. You get there eventually. Everyone realizes eventually that literacy is coming. Well, I say that, I mean, we're still sub 40%, but I wrote the book just to clarify this, because there are some countries where perhaps it's still not not central to government policy. But most people have got it. So yeah.
Okay, that's an interesting one. Yeah. So sort of get you to the fertility. So you make the argument that fertilities, small families have more savings in the bank, and then the governments essentially have lower interest rates, and that allows them to create the debt expansion to invest in electricity
At low cost, because
at
the
low
interest
cost.
rates are low in a high fertility. When you've got low fertility, you've got low interest rates. And so it's cheap to invest in infrastructure. It's why you go to Morocco and the roads are great, the ports are great, the electricity supply is plentiful. They're rolling out all the solar power on top of what is already a good base load for power, and it's industrializing. And the factories are going there. Renault's going there, Peugeot's going there. Renault's been there for 15 years now, actually, but more are coming in. It's leading Africa's second industrialization way.
And it's interesting you say that because I'm based in France, and I studied with a lot of people from the Arab world, and only the Moroccans have gone back home, and maybe some Tunisians. They study here, they maybe work for a year or two, get experience, and they say, "Well, I've got a job back home. Cost of living is much better. Why shouldn't I do that?" Whereas if I look at those from Egypt, maybe, or from Syria, which has obviously been destroyed by a civil war, they would like to stay here. And it's very interesting how this diaspora movement also ties in with your arguments.
Well, Egypt's interesting because it's about to change. They actually got their fertility rate down to nearly 3 kids, about 3.5, 20 years ago. And it's never quite gone down. In fact, it picked slightly up. Very rare, but it's happened. Sisi is now trying to push that lower again. He came out with an announcement, I think, at the beginning of this year. And they didn't have the adult literacy to industrialize until 2010. So they had the literacy of the elites 3,000-4,000 years ago to build pyramids, but they haven't had the mass literacy they need to build a textile industry. They grow the cotton, but don't have a textile export industry. Incredible, because they didn't have the mass literacy. But Egypt's about to change. But until it changes, until the fertility rate comes down, until the savings then go up and the interest rates come down, all of this, you've got a situation where you've got educated people, but no savings to give them jobs. What happens? You leave. You leave like the Irish did in the 1950s and 60s, and they fled, they went to England to try and find jobs. You leave like the Filipinos did in the 1990s, and they went to Hong Kong or to Singapore to get jobs. Or you leave like the Ugandans are doing now, getting on planes every week to go and get jobs.
South Africans are leaving as well,
Absolutely. South Africa is a complicated middle-income trap story. The book is much more geared at how do you get from that $0 to $2,000 per capita GDP up to $5,000-6,000. And South Africa's a very complicated country, I think, one of two countries really of a well-educated, relatively low fertility group, and then a poorly educated, lack of investment in that community with higher fertility group, and the savings and the wealth between the two reflect that long history.
Well, the light and the parameters that you highlight in your book, it explains also that our government, South Africa, the ANC, wasn't necessarily irrational. A lot of whites in particular believe they were just irrational in their decision making. But I remember, going to university. My grandfather already went to university. My father went. I went. But for the black people studying with me at the time, it was the first time, and many of their parents could barely read and write. It was just the reality of the situation. And I remember the government really was pushing literacy. It's one of the things that the ANC really was trying to push. And I think they probably pushed too hard, and maybe the quality went down a little bit. But it's sort of, I sort of get your feeling on this. It's almost as if the leaderships of these countries instinctively know these things. It might not always be expressed in the numerical language that you've put it in. But the debate in South Africa at the moment is electricity. It is what everyone is asking for, right? And a few years ago, it was literacy. So it's sort of like they are following your recipe without realizing it.
Yeah, and it's getting there. Even in Niger, which is the highest fertility country on the planet, with over 6 kids per woman, the president there totally gets it. He certainly hasn't read my book because he's been saying this stuff before I wrote it. So it is there. I think people do mostly get it. I think the difficulty for politicians, particularly in democracies, is when's the payback? The literacy payback. I show a graph in there, a map of Russia in 1897, and it's a map of imperial Russia, and it shows the high literacy Finland, the highest literacy region of Russia at the time was called Finland. And then I look at every other part of the imperial Russian Empire. And per capita GDP today, 120 years later, completely mirrors, echoes, aligns with that literacy rate. Now, the guy who decided there was going to be literacy in Finland in the 19th century isn't getting an awful lot of credit for Finland's economic success today, but he totally deserves it. The guys who got it right in Mauritius in the 1960s and 70s, when Nobel Prize winners said, Mauritius is doomed, but they were getting the basic education level right, and then they could start the takeoff in the 1980s. They didn't get the credit for the takeoff in the 1980s, even though it was the guys in power in the 1990s and 2000s who was Mauritius was doing really well. They got the credit, not the politicians who actually did the literacy work.
Mm. And you made this argument that Sisi in Egypt, who is quite a despicable dictator, is probably going to ride this wave as well.
Yes, I mean he's not quite there on the fertility, but he's trying. But by 2025 to 2030, Egypt has everything it needs to take off. And if he's in power, actually he would have been in power long enough, people probably would say but it's not really. It's about the literacy that Mubarak had sorted out by 2010. That was the essential. So yeah, I mean it happens a lot. Modi in India is getting a lot of credit for stuff that was actually done 20, 30 years ago. Low fertility in India, that's why it's taking off. 2 to 3 kids per woman. That's why they've got the savings to finance their growth. That's why India, no one's saying, when's India going to default on its foreign debt? It's because it hasn't needed much foreign debt. It's financed itself through its own savings because of its low fertility rate, just like China did.
That's very interesting. So, if I want to sort of pivot this, so we've gone through the 3 factors, literacy, obviously important, then electricity, and then fertility, they don't, in what order do you think they should be prioritized? So you obviously make the case literacy is first, but when should a country, look at what econometric measures should they look at before they say, okay, now we're going to push our money into electricity, or now we're going to push it into trying to get fertility down, for example?
Well, the fertility thing, I mean, the education absolutely comes first. The fertility thing is an interesting combination of not very expensive policy choices. You certainly don't want to do the China one-child policy. There's no need. Every other country in the world that's successful has got the fertility rate down without doing the one-child policy. So what do you need? You need to educate girls, but you've already done that if you've got the literacy number right. You need to reduce child mortality rate. So I'm still, somewhat staggered at the way we reacted to COVID, or the way some countries reacted to COVID. When 10% of kids under the age of 5 in Nigeria die because they're born in Nigeria, and the COVID fatality rate was about 1 to 2% for an entire population, and actually less in a young country.
Yeah.
So much was invested in COVID and stopping COVID and lockdowns, but actually money would have been far better spent. Every single dollar would have been better spent on basic child mortality protection in a country like Nigeria, where countries with the same wealth level, like Ghana, has a 4%. 4% of children die under the age of 5 versus Nigeria 10, but they're very similar per capita GDP. Cote d'Ivoire is less. Venezuela, for all of its disasters, vastly less. So if you want to get your fertility rate down, there's a very strong link. If you have 10% chance of losing your kid before the age of 5, you have 5 or 6 kids.
Yeah,
that's true of everywhere and has been true of everywhere. As you get it down, so anyway, you invest in basic child care, health issues. You educate girls, and then the government comes out and tells people, because you as an individual, me as an individual, we don't know. When you're 19, 20, you're thinking about having your first kid. Am I going to do it at what age? Maybe, even in the West, no one's saying to you, oh, you ought to do this, you ought to do that, because you'll find it easier over your lifetime. Maybe your parents tell you that, but it's when a government comes in and does a basic information campaign. 2 to 3 kids good was Indonesia's campaign in the 1980s and 90s. That has an effect. It has an effect. You offer contraception, you educate girls, you do the child health stuff, and that helps. None of it's a miracle quick win.
No.
Countries can get the fertility rate down by about 2 kids from, say, 5, which is way too much, to 3 in 20 years. It can be done in 20 years. It can be done in a decade, but it's much more plausible to do it in 20.
The way I've always understood it is the first one is nutrition, childhood nutrition, because I think if you look at life expectancy at 3 or 4 years, even in Nigeria, it's about the same as in some European countries, but life expectancy at 0 is much lower, and that's because of the child mortality. And so the first one I always suggested was nutrition, childcare, basic things like that stuff, and then the family planning. But what fertility generally comes down to is the empowerment of women in society. Whether women are in control of their own reproductive organs is primarily goal. And then, it was, I think, a South African economist who made the statement that the best contraceptive is to send your girl to university.
So true. It's an amazingly high proportion of Chinese women now who've gone to university and not married. So it's fascinating actually. In fact, in China, their one-child policy was so distorting. It had many more boys than girls. That actually the illiterate women are the ones who are definitively always married. Illiterate men are stuffed. They're struggling. But it's yes, there's an awful lot around it. I'm not trying to be prescriptive in the book about how a country chooses to reduce its fertility rate. All I'm saying is, if you don't get it below 3 kids, you won't get rich, ever.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And you make a good point in the book that many of these markers are already in the right direction in African countries.
Yeah.
And you were saying North Africa, maybe we spoke a little bit about it earlier, but maybe explain, like, where in Africa do you see the next industrial boom taking place, or the more likely conditions for the boom?
Yeah, so the country that got everything right, earliest, should probably say Shells, but it's so small I didn't focus on it, was Mauritius in the 80s. And it did then industrialize. It had a manufacturing sector that was over 20% of GDP, super successful. Morocco is now there, and they are going to be super successful. Tunisia is there. Egypt is very nearly there. Libya is just an oil story. They're lucky, tiny population, a lot of oil, different story. Algeria could be there if they do the reforms right. They've got the education, they've got the power. They could also be industrializing. But at that point, you start to get towards this middle income trap issue. Algeria is quite wealthy, relatively wealthy, and it does. Government policy then gets more complicated. It's quite easy at the beginning because it's just fertility, education, electricity. But afterwards, it becomes, do you have enough patents? Do you have enough university-educated people? Are you investing enough in research and development? There's a whole host of, and Algeria is at that point where you need absolutely interestingly reform-minded people saying, should we be spending all our money on subsidies, or should we be supporting investment? And to an economist, the answer is very, very easy. If you want the high growth over the next 10, 20 years, you've got to do anyway, point is, North Africa's in a very good place. They've got the challenge for them is getting women into the workforce.
So isn't that occurring already in some countries like Tunisia?
It's occurring, but it's not. Today, labor force participation rate in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, China, ranges from about 70% to 80%. So 70 to 80% of working age adults who can work, do work. Also true of the West, 65 to 70, up to 80, in fact, in places like Vietnam is over 80, 85%. Morocco is 50, 45. So there's a whole swathe of the population that's just not engaged yet, and it's happening at a younger women are getting into the workforce, but it's still not broad enough. So it comes back to my issue about how fast can an economy grow? And I've been thinking about trying to picture this. And if you're going to picture kind of two sets of 10 people, one in Nigeria, one in China, and you're trying to get those 10 people to build a house. Now you take 10 random people in Nigeria, 5 of them are children. And those 5 kids need looking after. They're not helping you build the house, they need looking after. So 2 or 3 of the adults are having to look after the 5 kids. So you're left with 3 adults out of those 10 people in Nigeria working. Go to China, they've got 2 or 3 kids out of any random 10 people. So you've now got 7 adults. Maybe one of them has to look after 2 or 3 kids. You've got 6 adults working on the house versus 3 adults working in the house in Nigeria. You've got double the workforce in China just from a random 10 people. So which country grows faster? China grows faster. Now, Morocco's problem is they've only got 2 or 3 kids, but of the 6, 7 adults who are now working age, 3 of them are women, 3 or 4 of them are women, and they're not participating in the workforce. You need to get more of them into the workforce to get Morocco to look more like China. They're educated enough, they could do it. And it is happening. It's just remove those barriers or have government information campaigns saying, this is good. We want women working in banking, in finance, in industry, in textiles, in every sector, services.
That's interesting. I mean, that they, as you say, but I think I've always taken the view that those markers will happen regardless of government policy. Government policies can only slow them down, but I don't think they can. I mean, if you take a country like Iran, for example, where most women are educated, or Tunisia for that matter, it's only a matter of time before the population demands those rights.
Yes.
We see signs of that already taking place.
Yes, absolutely right. Totally agree. And it does happen. The question is, it all comes down to speed. And what I'm arguing in this book is that, eventually every country is going to get the fertility rate down because everyone's going to be educating all their people, and eventually we'll get there. But the question is, how many decades or generations of poverty do current leaders want their country to experience before they get better off? How many millions of their people do they want to see leave the country because there's no savings in the country? How many defaults and devaluations do countries want to go through before they can stand on their own 2 feet and say, we don't need the IMF anymore. We don't need foreign borrowing anymore because we can do this on our own resources. And Mauritius's problem in the early 80s was that they were a colony of the IMF, according to leading opposition politicians. That's all they totally dependent on the foreign finance and so excess labor because they were well educated, but they didn't have the low fertility rate then, that they were trying to export their labor to Saudi Arabia to go and work in the booming oil sector at the time. Now, no one says that. Mauritius today is trying to get labor in because their fertility rate actually is under 2 kids per woman and needs to be a little bit higher. They're actually trying to get good, well-educated labor to come to Mauritius. They're not trying to export their labor. So surely people want to be in Mauritius' situation, I would argue, than Niger's or Somalia's. And
when you, I want to sort of talk a little bit about that. I mean, because we've touched a lot on the developing countries and the challenges, and as you say, the challenges are actually quite straightforward. On paper, obviously the political reforms and all these things is where the obstacle is, and then there's political interest at play that sometimes stand against these things. But once a country eventually gets here, you're seeing in Europe that fertility rates are falling, and guys like Elon Musk, for example, has been predicting the end of the world is coming because of population collapse. Now that we solved overpopulation, the problem is underpopulation. What do you say to that argument?
Yeah, that's quite right. And in 100 years' time, I'd love to be having that debate. I'll be quite old by then in Nigeria. But I guess what I'm trying to get across in the book is that the world is not uniform. And when I read, column after column in the Financial Times about the aging crisis in the West, front pages of The Economist, and I hear the cliche that Japan sells more nappies to its old people than to babies, I just think I despair, because the message that is heard repeatedly through this Western media is fertility is a problem in the West, and we've got to get it up. And who's arguing the counter to this? It's just, who's arguing that not every country is in that aging rich situation where yes, it is. He's right. Elon Musk has got a point about Northern Hemisphere. They're really struggling to get the fertility rate up in Iran, having pushed it really hard down in the 90s. They're really struggling to get back up again. Russia's struggled. Poland struggled. Korea is going to be the oldest country in the world by 2030. And it's not clear how they're going to get their fertility rate up again. So I would say that when you're doing your fertility campaigns, don't say one child is good, because we know where that ends. Say 2 to 3 kids is good, because that seems to work. That both gives you the savings now, but doesn't give you a population crisis in 50 or 100 years' time. It'll be 100 years for Nigeria, by the way, not 50. This is not. No one who's alive today needs to worry about Nigeria getting a fertility rate down too low.
Yeah, but I mean, is this really a function of what government does? I mean, governments have been trying to push up fertility. It doesn't seem to be having much impact. There's the roller coaster argument. I think it came from Sweden at one stage, where those who wanted children had them, and then sort of the curve just came up and down again. And I've been wondering if the inverse isn't true as well. Despite governments promoting fertility coming down, maybe if it isn't a factor of something else, of just urbanization, or the slow maybe advancement of women, regardless of what the government does.
I'm very interested by it, because I keep on reading. I mean, I do read the articles about what's going on in the West as well, partly because some emerging markets are aging, like Greece and Poland and Korea, as I've mentioned. In Japan, you see the argument that women are not given enough. They're so expected to give up the work, which their education enables them to be brilliant at, that as soon as they have the kid, they're still expected culturally to give up work at 30, 35, and they don't want to. So they just decide not to have any kids at all. That seems to be an issue. I mean, I've talked to friends in China who say that if you've come from this one child setup, as one professor was telling me, none of her friends can stay married, because they struggle to compromise, and if they're not getting married, they're not generally having kids then. And there's a whole host of different reasons. Are women given enough support when it comes to bringing up children? And is society geared around that? These are all really good issues. I don't talk about them in the book, because they are issues for 100 years' time for the countries I'm focusing on. Okay, so your argument is still that these basics need to take place, especially in the African continent that's now developing. Now, if you talk to African leaders or to finance ministers, I assume you've advised some, you speak on these big forums, what response do they tell you when you raise these questions? Is there pushback, or is there appreciation for the arguments? I'm a financial markets economist, so the primary audience for me are investors, fund managers, and corporates and so on, businesses, and not the politicians. So those few that I've got in front of, the vice president of Nigeria I did present these arguments to, and he said that's very interesting, but this is a difficult issue for religious reasons, or it seemed to be a difficult religious debate in Nigeria between the Muslim North and the more Christian South. And I was there with a former finance minister of Nigeria who himself had gone to Bangladesh to recognize that it's not a religious issue inherently. Islamic countries like Bangladesh have got a fertility rate below 2 kids. Yeah. It's why they export as much per capita today as India does. So they as successful. But there's so many challenges, I think, for politicians in the main, and there's not been a book that's brought this stuff together that they'll have read up about in the 70s or 80s. And if you think of other leaders, they may well have inherited some of the dependency theory arguments. Africa's held down because the price of commodities is too cheap, or they may have got the view that the colonial legacy had just doomed countries to a lack of success, or they may feel that the French currency peg in West Africa is what's holding back West Africa, or there's a whole host of reasons being thrown at people all the time as to why countries are being held back. Too much corruption, government's not good enough. And then there's one economist coming out and saying it might be to do with the fertility rate. No, it's not. Hopefully your podcast will spread the message. Yeah, no, that's sort of the idea. Tanzanian minister for investment and industry. She is a development economist. She sat there lecturing in Norway for years at university. And I was talking to her about education and fertility. She said, everyone talks about education, but the fertility story, that's key. So there are totally people who get it. I don't think it's a mainstream or widespread view yet.
Okay. Well, it's a hopefully we can break through it, because what I did like about the book is that you broke through I mean, you just spoke about the dogma that's been flown around in Africa about it's the West that's always out to get us, the French currency. I've heard that so many times in France. France is still a former colonial empire, and there's coup d'etats being instigated by America and other countries. That's sometimes true. I mean, I'm not neglecting all of that as complete nonsense, but you're basically saying none of those arguments are a sufficient explanation for the lack of development. You've got something that is held constant across communist countries, Asian countries, African countries, through the variety of countries. These are the markers of economic success and prosperity, basically.
Yeah, even the European story. So the reason Europe's industrial revolution actually took so incredibly long, I mean, it really was like over 100 years, was because their fertility rates weren't below 3. They never had a massive savings. So British companies had to do it from their own savings or go and get cash from friends and family. For many companies in the UK's industrial revolution, which took so long, was because there was a lack of finance. And I would argue that was because the fertility rate actually didn't fall in Europe until the 20th century, which is why Europe took so long. Asia sped it up, and that's why Asia's development has been so much faster. And Africa has the potential to do that, or be Latin America, which, like Europe, had a really slow fertility decline through the 20th century and a much slower economic growth profile as a result. That's the choice.
And that so those countries that are in the middle income trap, to sort of make a last point about them, they're a little bit different. As you say, fertility has come down, and they now have the potential, at least, for savings. Obviously speaking of South Africa, Brazil, Iran, I think is also there. All these countries, you're making the argument that they should just push electricity supply now to try and escape that middle income trap.
Well, no, you undoubtedly, if South Africa doesn't sort out its energy problems, it's at risk of losing middle income status. Is the problem that you'll be heading back towards a lower income story, and indeed relatively, that's what's been happening. If you go back 20 years, South Africa's per capita GDP was on a par with Poland. Now, Poland today is about $15,000-$20,000 per capita GDP. South Africa is more like $6,000. So your peers now in South Africa are Iran, and Iran's got a whole host of its own issues, as you know. So the risk is that if this doesn't get sorted out, the peer won't be Iran anymore. It's going to be, I don't know, an Algeria or less. So that's the direction South Africa's going in at the moment, unfortunately. For the rest, no, it's about research. It is about research. It's about investing in universities. It's about moving up that value-added curve, which China's doing brilliantly well. Vietnam.
But that knowledge-based economy, but that's as you say, it's a difficult one, and there's maybe not one recipe because it's specific sectors that you need to focus on.
Well, for South Africa, the first priority has got to be getting 30-40% unemployed into jobs. I mean, that, and I would have thought low-cost manufacturing makes the most sense for the country in terms of suddenly getting, you've got those 10 people trying to build a house. Well, 3 of the adults in South Africa are not working, can't find a job. They're not being given the chance to build that house. So this is a real, that's the first bit of the problem to resolve. And well, I say first, if there's no energy for that factory to work, there's no factories going to be set up. So it's
it's the one I wish our politicians. I mean, because what frustrates me and what frustrates so many South Africans about this is that everyone knows this. Okay, it's sort of instinctive, and yet the policy is not following the right direction. And I don't understand why there is this major resistance to just adding electricity supply to the grid. I mean, this is not a major how would I say, communist manifesto we're asking for any revolution. It's something so basic to development, and yet that is not occurring.
Well, I mean, I'd love to get your view on this, because my sense was Zuma and his lot didn't want that to happen because they made a lot of money out of the failure, or the failure came about them making too much money out of the story. But Ramaphosa's proposal allowing companies in South Africa to build their own power supply, I think up to 100, is it 100 megawatts?
Yeah, that's what's being proposed.
Like that could be a bit of a game changer.
Yeah, the challenge in South Africa has been also this rent seeking from the ruling party. We have a Byzantine times law that allows rent seeking in legislations, known as BEE. It's been controversial since the start. And we know the ruling party, whatever decision is being made, they would like to have their fingers in that pie. And that to me that has stopped lots of investors from going into the country. And also, as you say, during Zuma time, they just looted the money. They didn't care. Ramaphosa, he is still true to that ideological doctrine, but at least, I mean, I'm not even sure if that's entirely true, but there's been some signs that at least he appreciates that the solutions must be more pragmatic. But we have heard a lot of talk and no results at the moment. So, it's sort of, it's the frustration that everyone has got. And the reason I and many South Africans are sitting where I'm sitting today, it's not because we've left because we wanted to, it's because we are part of a skilled class of people. And as you point out quite right in your book, if you skill people to university level and there's no electricity, they just leave the country. We're a typical case of what you've been explaining.
Yeah. So politics, I think at the middle income level really matters. So the biggest failures, Venezuela, or actually Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka as well. I find the exceptions to my book more interesting in some ways than when the book says a high fertility country defaults, which is what's happened in Zambia, Chad, Ethiopia, probably Ghana imminently, Pakistan in the next year or two. That's less interesting to me than the exceptions. So the exceptions are places like, well, there's very few, but Argentina all the time, Venezuela, Lebanon and Sri Lanka. And it always comes back to politics. It takes a special skill set to blow an economy up that is literate with electricity and low fertility. I mean, it really takes quite exceptional skill to blow it up. And it's fascinating and gives political
and Israel is the exception to all these rules because it's maintained high fertility and yet grown the economy and done reasonably well.
Yeah, I'm really interested by that because they've got this 3.1. They're at just literally the highest fertility rate by far of any country with their child mortality rate. So kids don't die under the age of 5, and they've got this, but it's a very small part of it was a small part of the population. It was the ultra-Orthodox who were trying to repopulate those killed during the Holocaust. Your average urbanized Israeli has much smaller family.
Well, so this has been pointed out by city planners a long time ago that religious people tend to have more children, whether it's bad or good. But it's even the case in the United States. It's one reason why the United States, of all the developed countries, maintains a higher fertility rate than the rest of the world. The US is still not bad. It's actually not as much to do with immigration, but religion. And the United States is more religious than Europe. Okay, so why it applies to Israel as well. Why exactly? I've got a question for you from the audience as well. They ask you, what is your view on the French-speaking countries such as Senegal? Is that a nice place to put your money, or what challenges do they face?
Look, on a 1-2 year view, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, I think are going to be doing well. You've got an overly strong dollar. You've got a weak euro. They're euro-linked, so they're cheap, relatively, to invest in right now. And you've got very smart leadership in Cote d'Ivoire. He's an economist, of course. I'm going to like him, president, but he's, he may have been there a little. He won't be there forever, but he's supported this good investment-led growth story.
Right.
And Senegal's got this energy story, which is going to boost its growth dramatically. So 1-2 years, yes. 5 years, 10, more. I'm concerned. The adult literacy rate in these two is around 50 to 60%, and it hasn't
even Senegal.
Yeah.
It's astonishing to me because many of the educated people in my office are Senegalese, So.
Dakar is a very different story. The urban centres, fantastic story, but you go out to the rural areas and vast numbers of the population still illiterate. I've got anyway. So that that's the challenge. And I had a chat to the Cote d'Ivoire Prime Minister about this in 2018 and said, look, this is a big issue. And he said, funny, the World Bank's talking about this female adult literacy thing too, and then we're going to do something about it. He then died, sadly, and he was likely to be the next president. So I don't know, that was still an exchange where I'm saying this feels fundamental to your reform, and the response was, yeah, this is one of the many things we're trying to think about.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, and I compare this again to Iran, where Iran's literacy rate is 85, and it's been stagnated for the last 10 years at 85. And the illiteracy is concentrated in Abadan and I think Baluchistan, the two rebellious provinces at the moment. And what played a factor there to get teachers and people there has been environmental issues, actually. I don't think it's the case in Senegal, but in the case of Iran, it's been water scarcity. Okay, so they had to invest into desalination to get those areas educated, because for some reason the people didn't leave the countryside. So what I suspect is happening in Dakar and Senegal is the politicians are balancing the interests of the middle class against the interests of the very poor parts of the country. And you find middle class aspirations can easily result into what happened during the Arab Spring, while simultaneously the rest of the country is still underdeveloped. And this is a big problem in South Africa as well that happened with the Rhodes Must Fall riots a few years ago, where it was black educated university students who led the riots. The working class stayed away. So the government then pivoted to this free education demand. They made it. So you find this, the class issues plays a big role here to me as well, where I mean, understand your broader macro story. It makes complete sense to me. But when it comes to the practical realities, it's a question of balancing interests. And maybe that can explain some of the Senegalese issues and part of the African story as well.
That's very interesting, because that also fits with, I was talking about kind of what triggers communist revolutions, and it always that to what extent does to what extent are you carrying the urban areas with you? Because when you lose the urban areas in Russia, albeit with World War I and all the rest going on, you end up with that revolution. If you don't hold on to the urban, and it's this challenging bit where you've got a well-educated population that's gone low fertility, and they're living in the city, and the opportunities are not as good as they would be if the whole country had it. But do you continue to invest to support those successful part of the population? Or are you teaching people to fish, or are you giving fish? And the risk is you're giving fish by taking away from those people and giving it to the rural areas who can't do much with it on a 10-year view, but on the 20-year view, if they're educated and literate and low fertility, they'll take off as well. So that's a very challenging issue you're getting at, actually.
Yeah, and it's also a case, I think, in the United States to some extent, not maybe on the level of literacy, but if you take the heartland, I mean, part of the reason that Trump got elected, he was saying clean coal. He was speaking to the communities in the heartland whose jobs went to China. Mm-hmm. Now, a pure economist would look at that and say, but that was great that jobs went to China. We got cheaper goods, and you're just going to work in services now. Everyone gets the jobs. But then there's a cohort of the population say, hey, I'm a guy working with my hands, and that has the backlash in the politics. So, your argument is solid and nice if the whole world is run by economists. And technocrats, but where I think it runs into the practical problems is the political interest involved, and maybe that is why I'm I wish people would follow these arguments, and I wish the electorate would understand them, because I think ultimately it's also the benefit of the urbanites to educate the rest of the population. Otherwise, they're going to be swamped in a mob as well. So that I think it's just the argument has to be made in a way, and people needs to know how much it's going to cost and how much time it's going to take and who's accountable, all those arguments. And I think that's where the practicalities might be the stumbling block.
And I think this is, what you're getting at there, though, is that issue of it's time passing. I'm interested by the fact that I didn't focus on demography until I was, by my view of it, old. When I was a young guy, I thought the world would change in 5 years. When I've sat there watching per capita GDP in some countries not move in 10 years, I suddenly don't think 10 years is quite as long a period. I mean, it's too long, but it doesn't feel, it feels like I don't want to wait another 20 years. And I can imagine now waiting 20 years. I can imagine seeing what might happen in 20 years' time. And I don't want to be sitting there having the same debates in Nigeria or Senegal or Cote d'Ivoire about what's holding back their countries. and the same arguments being recycled again and again and again when the data is already telling us what needs to be done.
Have you made these arguments to philanthropic organizations as well? There's a lot of them that would like to solve the world's problems, sometimes too altruistic, and there's skepticism against them. And isn't it maybe a case that some of them are putting their money in the wrong location? I mean, I would take a country like Senegal. Let's say, okay, we have this educated elite, and we're going to focus a little bit on high growth economy as well. We can't just cater to the working class all the time. But those who would want to help and invest in social responsibility needs to throw their money at the illiterate part of the population. That's sort of how I would present it.
I'm very sympathetic to that. I happen to support Plan International, and that it's all about educating this girl, as it turns out, in Senegal. Not as it turns out, obviously, that I support that sort of thing, but that's what I would do. I think that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is curiously on the right track on what they're talking about. They've really thought about this. The Center for Global Development, has already done a podcast with me some months ago, which is financed by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But so a little bit, but I guess my angle is different from their angle. My angle is, what does a businessman need to know? What does a corporate need to know? What does a fund manager need to know about this country's, say, risk of default, and how that links to fertility? And I'm saying it matters to politicians and the person on the ground. So it's very, very broad ranging, but I'm coming at this from a business and economics perspective.
Right.
Do you want to see your economy grow fast or not? Most of the aid agencies out there are coming from it from a much more honorable, moral perspective, perhaps. But
there's skepticism against them as well. But yes, if you, especially in the last 2 years. But yes, definitely. I mean, it's a question of allocation of resources. I mean, that's what economics is about, right? Scarcity. We have limited finite resources. We need to distribute them. And I guess, it's just sort of the last point I would make. I think what your book describes quite well to me is the long-term story that countries have to follow. Okay, where it might, I don't think it was the intention of the book, but where it doesn't always come into is these practical solutions. I mean, your solutions you offer are for the macros, right? They're for the broader term, they're for investors, all of these things. But I would say that if there's a follow-up, it has to look into the politics and how to balance these interests and risks.
Yes, that's an interesting idea. That's an interesting idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlie. I enjoy it. As I say to people, this is the book, Time Traveling Economist, Why Education, Electricity, and Fertility Are the Key to Escaping Poverty. And broader public should read it. Thank you very much.
And on the Springer website, it's e-version and it's available. So Time Traveling Economist, Springer, and you'll find the link to it. It will be on Amazon eventually, I am told, but I've been hoping that.
I got it on Amazon.
On the physical copy, yeah? The Kindle edition is still waiting. But yeah.
Okay. I'm still old school books, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much for hosting me, Hugo. Cheers.